For the Indiana Fever, this season began with excitement, but quickly spiraled into something no one saw coming. Caitlin Clark, the rising star meant to lead a new era in Indiana, was averaging over 16 points a night and giving fans hope that playoffs weren't just possible, but expected. Then, after only 13 games, she went down with a torn groin, ending her season and sending shockwaves through the league. That loss alone felt crushing, but the bad news didn't stop there. Sophie Cunningham was lost to a knee injury. Khloe Bibby followed with the same. Colson and Ari McDonald were sidelined too. In total, 5 key contributors disappeared, leaving Indiana with holes everywhere on the court. By midseason, 18 different players had suited up, making the roster look more like a patchwork project than a playoff team. Most franchises would have folded under that kind of pressure. Instead, for Indiana, the disaster became the challenge that defined them. All the grit and patience finally came together on one defining night. Facing the Washington Mystics, the Fever entered with their season hanging in the balance. The first half felt tense, both teams trading buckets, neither side breaking away. Then came the third quarter, and Indiana unleashed something special. Their defense locked in so tight that Washington managed only 9 points in the entire frame. Every pass was contested, every shot smothered, and suddenly the Fever were running the floor with confidence. By the time the fourth quarter rolled around, the game was no longer close. Indiana's lead stretched past 20, then 30, and the final score read 94-65. It wasn't just a win, it was a statement. With half their core watching in street clothes, the Fever didn't just survive, they dominated. That blowout secured their playoff spot, silenced the doubts, and proved to the league that this team's identity had shifted from fragile to fearless. Through all the chaos, one steady voice kept the Fever centered. Aliyah Boston. As injuries piled up and rotations changed almost nightly, Boston became more than just Indiana's anchor in the paint. She became the anchor for their mindset. Her mantra was simple but powerful: find a way. It echoed in practices, huddles, and post-game talks. No matter how many teammates were lost, no matter how tough the matchup, Boston reminded everyone that excuses wouldn't win games, only effort would. She led by example, battling on the boards, setting hard screens, and doing the dirty work that doesn't always make headlines but wins possessions. Younger players fed off her energy, and veterans leaned on her calm presence. That phrase, find a way, became more than motivation. It turned into the Fever's identity. When they looked over and saw Boston still fighting, still demanding more, it was impossible not to believe that survival was still possible, even in the darkest stretches. What the Indiana Fever proved this season goes far beyond wins and losses. Their story became a reminder of what sports at their core are really about: resilience. Injuries stripped away their stars, critics counted them out, and the roster turned into a revolving door of replacements. Yet somehow, instead of breaking, they found strength in the struggle. The message was clear: adversity does not define you. How you respond to it does. This team responded with fight, with grit, and with an unshakable belief that effort could outlast any obstacle. For the fans, it was more than just basketball. It was a lesson about pushing forward when life feels impossible. For the league, it was proof that the Fever are no longer a footnote, but a franchise capable of redefining itself under fire. Their journey wasn't polished or easy, but it was powerful. And in the end, that's the legacy this season will carry. Indiana found a way. Long after the final scoreboards fade and the playoff run is logged in the record books, the 2025 Indiana Fever season will be remembered less for statistics and more for its story. This was the year a team refused to let disaster define them. It will be remembered as the season when Caitlin Clark's injury could have ended everything. But instead, it sparked a transformation. It was the season when players most people overlooked became critical pieces, when Aliyah Boston's mantra turned into the heartbeat of a franchise, and when Stephanie White's gamble paid off in the most unexpected way. Years from now, when fans look back at the Fever's rise, they'll point to this season as the foundation, not for how smooth it was, but for how chaotic, messy, and inspiring it became. The legacy of 2025 is clear. Indiana proved that even in the hardest seasons, greatness can be forged from struggle. Reaching the playoffs was an achievement, but the Fever's true victory may have been laying the groundwork for what comes next. This season forced the franchise to find depth, to test resilience, and to discover who could be trusted when the spotlight was harsh. Those lessons won't vanish when the injuries heal. Instead, they become part of the team's DNA moving forward. Imagine a fully healthy Caitlin Clark returning to a roster that has already learned how to win without her. Imagine Aliyah Boston, surrounded by teammates, hardened by the fire of adversity. The Fever are no longer a young, untested group. They're a team that has lived through the worst and come out standing. For Indiana, this playoff berth feels less like the end of a story and more like the prologue. The struggles of this year may one day be remembered not just as survival, but as the birth of a contender. While headlines often circled around Caitlin Clark's injury or Aliyah Boston's leadership, the Fever's survival also rested on the shoulders of players who rarely made national news. These were the unsung heroes, the ones who stepped into roles bigger than they'd ever imagined. Odyssey Sims provided steady veteran playmaking when chaos seemed to overwhelm the backcourt. Aerial Powers brought toughness and scoring bursts at key moments. Even short-term signings who wore a Fever jersey for just a handful of games left their mark with hustle plays and defensive stops. Every contribution mattered because there was no safety net. Every possession could swing a season teetering on collapse. The fact that so many stepped up proved Indiana's strength wasn't in one star, but in a collective. Each next woman up moment built momentum, and together they kept the season alive. They weren't just filling spots on a roster, they were the glue holding a fractured team together. When the final buzzer sounded and the standings locked in, the Indiana Fever had done the unthinkable. They were back in the playoffs. For a franchise that had been stuck in rebuilding mode for years, the return alone felt monumental. But this wasn't a story of a team cruising behind a healthy superstar. It was a story of survival, adaptation, and belief. They had clawed their way through setbacks that would have broken most rosters, and now they stood among the league's best. Fans who once feared another lost season were suddenly celebrating something far bigger, proof that the Fever had rediscovered their fight. Making the postseason wasn't just about extending their schedule by a few games, it was about sending a message. Indiana wasn't going to vanish into the background anymore. They had built a culture that refused to fold, even when the odds were stacked against them. The playoffs weren't the finish line, they were the ear for never giving up. When the roster began collapsing, the easy route for Indiana would have been panic. Most coaches would scramble for answers, change systems, and hope for a miracle. But Stephanie White took the opposite approach. Instead of forcing complicated plays on a constantly shifting roster, she simplified the game. Her message was clear: stay grounded, focus on effort, and trust the next woman up. She leaned into grit and discipline, reminding the team that toughness could be their identity when talent was stripped away. And the players bought in. Veterans like Odyssey Sims and Aerial Powers gave the group stability. Role players like Shea Petty carved out unexpected opportunities. Every game felt like a test, and every new signing had to be ready to contribute immediately. What looked like a broken roster slowly grew into a unit built on resilience. White's gamble wasn't about finding stars to replace the missing ones, it was about building a team that refused to quit.